Night and day had little distinction within the maze of the underground tunnels, serving as home for the subterranean exiles. They had traveled a little ways from where Keith had first entered the abandoned subway to their living quarters, a large communal room, which at one time had been a storage shed for subway cars. Light was furnished by large railway lanterns, which hung on pegs along the walls, and heat by a single fire in the center of the room. The air was pungent with smoke and body odor. There are more of them here than had greeted him when he stumbled upon their domain. They had him sit alone, to where they could keep their eye on him, granting him the privilege of not being bounded like a prisoner. They even cleaned his bloody arm and bandaged the wound, leaving him with the blanket and the worst coffee he ever tasted. As he sat watching the group, Keith was amazed by the number of females present. They made up nearly a fourth of the inhabitants, with most cuddling with a man. Their devotion, he decided, must have made them reject the freedoms of the outside world for the underground darkness. Only, the girl in red did not seem to belong to any particular male. She moved about the group with self-assurance, pausing here and there for scattered bits of conversation. Occasionally, as if aware of his eyes following her, she would glance in his direction and then quickly away. She still wore the same red dress and high black boots, but her hair was neatly combed and her overall appearance pleasing. She was young, no more than 19, with high cheekbones and pale green eyes. Her posture was one of dignity, and her attitude was that of a woman with a mission. The way she stood and moved suggested inner calm and sensitivity. If her life had been tragic, it was well hidden. The gray-haired man he had hurt, to whom he heard the others refer to as Rinehart, seemed to be the center of conversation. He sat beside the fire, a warm blanket over his shoulders, and his hands wrapped about his coffee cup. The fire blazed in his one eye, giving his face the appearance of a demonic collar, while his eye patch made him even more menacing. He spoke low to his listeners, as if speaking to himself alone.
It was fate. Women taking over. It's the fault of weak men. White knights, they called themselves. Chivalry and that bullshit. Judas's fucks, selling out their kind for a little pussy. The reward? Emasculation. Before they realized their mistake, it was too late. They didn't even get their 30 pieces.
Keith set his coffee cup aside, pulled his blanket about his shoulders, and lay his head back. He had heard such conversation repeatedly amongst males in the ghetto. Personal accounting of where they were when the men lost, and whispered predictions of the overthrow of female rule.
The bitches claimed to want equality. But with a taste of power, how could they not take it? Who could deny the power with ease to which they achieved it? Why remain an equal when they could become the oppressor?
Keith closed his eyes and tried to drown out the monotonous thrum of the man's voice. Although his arm had been bandaged, it continued to throb with nagging pain. Unconsciously, he began to rub it.
Does it still hurt?
It was the girl in red. She stood above him, smiling.
If it did, it's forgotten now.
She laughed and sank to the floor beside him. Since coming to the tunnels, this was the first conversation he had with any of them.
Less than a day away from the outside world, and already you're becoming a flirt? How quickly men adjust to changes.
She glanced towards the others.
Have you yet compared us to any group in the past?
He followed her gaze, wondering in what sense she saw her bedraggled companions.
The early Christians in the catacombs of Rome?
She brought up her knees and used her arms as a rest. Her head leaned forward as she watched him closely for a reaction.
Perhaps you've never read the Bible? I believe it was one of the many books burned. Our leaders objected to the part that said a woman was created of a man's rib to satisfy his loneliness. The battle of the sexes even raged in Eden.
And woman was man's downfall. Yes, I've read the Bible. There was a copy in the Hall of Records.
Was that your crime? Were you caught reading forbidden material?
Worse than that.
Another Eve?
Keith nodded.
And the Hall of Records was the Garden of Eden.
Was it worth it?
Keith did not have a ready answer. How often since the day in the stockroom had he asked himself the same question, unable to answer? He merely shrugged and lowered his gaze.
You're a rebel, my friend. I knew that the first moment I looked at you in the subway. If it had not been a girl, some other crime would have eventually brought you to us. We are a collection of rebels and beggars, criminals and martyrs.
The Christian similarity again.
He was aware of her closeness, the musky fragrance of her body. She reminded him vaguely of Marianne, his Eve, and he found himself wondering if she too, in the abandonment of sex, would be as submissive, though Marianne only displayed submissiveness after being so aggressive in her interests of him.
But unlike the early Christians, we are fighters. We do not believe in the turn the other cheek attitude. We want reforms now, not 100 years from today. As a woman, I want a man I can respect, not a spineless creature as women of today would have them be.
But there are so few of you to fight so many.
Not so few as you may think. There are many groups like ours scattered about below ground. It would be unwise for us to stay together.
A few members of the group turned their attention towards her. Noticing their looks, she lowered her voice.
And we have many sympathizers above ground. Men who charade as meek workers and women who feel as I do. Together, we'll fight the establishment until there is a balance between the sexes.
She lay her head back against the wall and closed her eyes.
Forgive me for preaching. I've been trying to make a convert of you, and you haven't even been cleared from the outside.
As though his intense stare aroused her from drowsiness, she once again opened her eyes.
We'll know tonight.
She closed her eyes again. Keith's exhaustion had left him. The reminder that his life still hung in the balance had dispelled all desire for rest. He felt like a condemned man waiting for a reprieve. He had to remain awake and alert until that final moment when the pendulum of fate swung for or against him. How could he be certain that a notice for his arrest would be issued? Perhaps there'd be a delay, in the processing of paperwork. It could cost him his life. He looked at the occupants of the communal room again, from a new viewpoint. If proof that he was who he claimed to be did not come from the outside contact, they would be his executioners. And if he was authenticated, he would become a companion fighter. Whatever his fate, he was forever bound to them. He wondered what sort of fighting he would be forced into. As an employee of the House of Records, he had access to information that was never released to the public. He recalled the reports of terrorist bombings and attempted assassinations. The blame had always been with all male fanatical groups. He had wondered if it was groups like this one that was responsible, though the reports left out any female involvement. He thought to ask the girl in red if this was that sort of group, if they were the terrorists of the Feminist Society. He was sure she would correct him, stating that they were in fact rebels and not terrorists. But he knew that was a matter of perspective. She, however, was asleep. He knew this by a cute little snore she had. He looked at her angelic face with soft lips, but soon his eyes peered down at her breasts, rising and falling within her jacket. He shifted under his blanket with the excitement of her body. He felt the desire to hold her close, to be that man she desired, to be her protector, even though right now she was his protector. Without her, he would be lying dead in the mud of the subway tracks. Another thought came to him, one that made him feel a bit ashamed. Here he was, imagining her naked and feeling her softness against him, and he didn't know her name. What kind of creep does that? Perhaps men were the animals that feminists said they were, saying that they were born rapists. But no, he had no desire to harm her. Even if feminist society said all men were bad, he knew he was good. He looked away from her and stared into the darkness. Tonight we'll know, she had told him. Obviously she meant this night, as it was already night when he came here. But how much longer? An hour? Perhaps 2? His eyes stung from the smoke, which hung about the ceiling of the room in a blue haze. It was painful to keep his eyes open as they were dry. Against his better judgment, he lay his head back, only inches from the girl in red, and closed his eyes. His thoughts continued to race, which turned into not-so-pleasant dreams, until he was awakened abruptly. He had felt his hands grasping the girl's arms, and her rising to her feet is what jarred him into alertness.
What we've been waiting for has come.
He sat up and watched as she threaded her way through the maze of sleepers towards the door, where the young woman stood, talking in whispers to several men. The newcomer was obviously the outside contact. Unlike the women of the underground, she was impeccably dressed in a severe gray suit. Her lips moved rapidly in conversation, appearing nervous and eager to make her exit. She smiled weakly at the girl in red when she approached, and handed her a manila envelope. Keith's eyes focused on the envelope, following its movements. He wanted to stand, but was paralyzed with fear. Fighter or prisoner, he wondered. Life or death. He watched as it was torn open with several papers removed. The girl in red glanced at them, and then passed them to one of the men. The man cursed beneath his breath. Keith's emotions betrayed him. In today's world, it was difficult enough to have so much as a cordial interaction between a man and a woman. Yet not moments ago, he'd been wondering what a relationship with her might be like, without the feminist's watchful eye. But now, in this moment, as life hung in the balance, entirely dependent upon what those papers had on them, he felt an onset of rage at her for keeping him in the dark. The man, whom he heard others call Webster, passed the papers back before retiring to a corner of the room and wrapping himself in a blanket next to a woman. Another man left the women and raked at the fire with a metal stick and tossing more coal into the pit. Surely, if he were to be executed, it would be the men to do it. Still, he was unsure of what to think. He got to his feet and was about to make his way across the room until he saw the girl in red walk towards him.
Well, your Eve might have been the Virgin Mary herself, for the furor it's caused with the mayor. She's offered a sizable reward for your capture and swears to make a public example of your punishment. From now on, you can consider yourself a subterranean. In fact, Webster mentioned using you on the mission he's scheduled for later tonight.
She grabbed him by the arm and pulled him with her as she sat down. Keith, still shocked by everything he heard, offered no resistance. She grabbed the blanket and put it on both of them. She rested her hand on his shoulder. He thought about what she said. Now being a part of the group. Now being a subterranean. Not a word he had heard before, though he understood what it meant. Not that it helped him understand what it entailed, or why anyone would want him on a mission. Her hands came across his stomach, and his mind focused on her once more. Again, uncomfortable by the fact that he didn't know her name. If he were to cuddle with her tonight, he needed to know her name.
You still awake?
She shifted slightly, but didn't open her eyes.
I didn't get your name.
Angela.